And these sexual assaults included black women being subjected to abusive and highly racialized strip searches, particularly in the context of the policing of the war on drugs, or, as in the case of Ms. B, just as a tool of racialized, sexualized police brutality and domination. And that was happening to poor or black women like Ms. B, or women who were living in low-income communities, to DV survivors, as we were just talking about, to people who were perceived to be involved in the sex trades. That involved strip searches, it involved being told to strip at police stations to put on a show for the cops, or it involved actual physical or sexual assault by the police, and or extortion of sexual favors by the police in exchange for leniency. And so as we documented those experiences, it just became clear, and it wasn't the first time I'd heard about this. I mean, I had my own experience of being a homeless person who was being sexually harassed and then went to police for help and got sexually harassed again, and so it was pretty clear in my mind what the answer was. But what happened here was like sort of a questioning of, all of a sudden we're all looking, sitting here going, well, wait a minute, we're talking to the police about preventing or better responding to sexual assault, yet they are among the primary perpetrators, and they weren't rogue officers, they were all the officers, right? And so it really made us think about our investment in law enforcement, which was pretty heavy at the time in Toronto as a response to police violence, but also looking to other ways. And so what happened is when I moved then to the US, thanks to the work of Beth and Val and other founders of Insight who are here today, I was able to walk into a beautiful movement and analysis that was being created that was precisely where I had come to through this experiences in Toronto. And you know, a year ago today, Beth, you and I were celebrating the beginning of the 10th year anniversary of the Critical Resistance Insight Statement on Gender Violence in the Prison Industrial Complex. And so a year later, here we are celebrating that statement again and your book. And I really encourage folks to read it, because 10 years ago, folks were putting out there this notion that the invisibility of women of color's experiences of state violence and of police violence could no longer stand, and nor could our movements for abolition continue to ignore our responsibility to come up with those alternatives and to make them real on the ground and to try them out and try them again. And that was central to our movement against police brutality. That was central to our movement against prison violence. It was central to our movement for safety in our communities, that we all had a responsibility to do that. And that really, being able to walk into that work, really has helped me grow and build my analysis and deepen it, and as has Beth's scholarship in Compelled to Crime, which is a really important book that you should also read, as well as Queering, I'm sorry, it's written right here. I can't read my own writing. Oh, that's terrible. Queering Prison Abolition. Yes, work. So it feels really important when we're thinking about, so that's sort of a trajectory of a lesson I learned, how I learned the lessons from the anti-violence movement. And I feel like what I drew from that and what I feel like the lessons we need to apply as we think about responses to other kinds of violence are that the policing of gender and sexuality are integral and instrumental to the racialized policing of race and of poverty, and of policing in general in this country. And policing by actual law enforcement, but also policing by policing institutions, which include those institutions that we tend to offer up as alternatives to the criminal legal system. Those social workers who are policing just as hard as the police, and doing it with access to food and benefits and clothing and the things that you need, healthcare. And that feels important. And it's important to remember that as part of the prison nation, police really play a frontline role in not just enforcing laws that are unjust that you can repeal or change, but they make law every day, every time they interact with you, when they decide who's worthy of protection, who's worthy of punishment, who's suspicious, who they're going to surveil, who they're going to ignore, who they're going to turn over to another institution to police and punish. And so that feels like an important lesson. And it feels like an important lesson to remember that they don't change their stripes when they switch their role from enforcer to protector, as in the case we heard just clearly in those stories and so many others that are in Beth's book. And they really police kind of the racialized lines around who gets to be a victim and then who's not. So as a result, it's really critical to remember that responses that rely on law enforcement and policing really reproduce and facilitate and enable and reinforce violence against women of color. There's been no decrease in the amount of violence. Beth, details the litany of statistics that tell you that there's been no decrease, but there's been increased opportunities for violence at the hands of the state through the prison nation. And so those feel that we need to apply those lessons when we think about responses to other kinds of violence. So the first question we need to ask is, does the approach that we're using actually decrease violence? Seems, I don't know, and apparently not. So, and then the second thing we need to do is, like, what are the people who are experiencing the violence at the margins in the most multiple and intersecting ways, what are they saying they need? And most often it's not more police, because they're one of the main sources of violence they're experiencing. So what does that mean, for hate crimes legislation, for responses to homophobic and transphobic violence? Didn't work out so well for the New Jersey Four. What Beth didn't mention was that Dude tried to accuse them of doing a hate crime against a heterosexual man. That happens all the time, where these kinds of laws, particularly where it comes to like bullying, sort of the laws, which are the younger cousins of hate crime laws in schools, LGBTQ youth of color are pushed out and arrested more than anyone else in schools, and Erica's work and other people show you that. Hate crime laws help do that, believe it or not. We talk about Violence Against Women Act and trying to, that we want an LGBT inclusive Violence Against Women Act. What did we learn? We're going to throw a whole other community into this morass. While at the same time, we want, and the thing that I want us to remember is that when we want recognition of violence against us, the only way we can see that recognition and see that violence against us is being seen, recognized, and addressed is through the criminal legal system, and we have to be willing to step away from that. We don't want to make the same mistakes in responses to violence and exploitation against people who are or are perceived to be involved in the sex trades. And we don't want to make the same mistakes when we're thinking about, as you were talking about, how we're going to apply sex offender registration laws. And I feel like we want to really think about the connections between, and I rely here on Kathy Cohen's work, the relationships, and we saw this in New Orleans a lot, which is, so in New Orleans, if you were offering oral or anal sex for money, could be charged under the prostitution law or under the crime against nature law. Ooh, very dangerous and scary, and that's what it was. Because if they charged you under the crime against nature law, it was a felony up until 2010. 5-year mandatory sentence, with or without hard labor, which is real, on a plantation in New Orleans called Angola. And then, when you came out, mandatory sex offender registration for 15 years to life. Guess who get charged under crime against nature as opposed to prostitution? Gay men, trans women, and poor black women who, when this law is being enforced against the backdrop of a society that has internalized and reproduces narratives about black women's bodies and sexualities as inherently deviant and deserving of greater punishment, that's who wound up on the sex offender registry. People go, oh, that's a unique story, it was just one case. No. A young woman named Antonice Brown, 18, just a few months over 18, sends a text to her girlfriend, who's just a few months under 18. It was racy, it was flirty. I'm sure every single person in this room has sent or received such a text. There was no photographs, there was no violence, yet Antonice got charged with enticing a minor under pornography and laws, and got threatened with a felony and mandatory sex offender registration charge, and pled down to something else so she wouldn't have to register as a sex offender, but did time for sending a text because someone was policing her gender and sexuality and that of her partner. These are the realities of relying on law enforcement as a solution to violence. And I really want us to not make these same mistakes again when we respond to homophobic violence, transphobic violence, trafficking, sexual exploitation, and coercion, because when you ask the people who experience these kinds of violence, if you ask the Young Women's Empowerment Project, which documents the experiences of young girls in the sex trades, I have the privilege of serving on their board, if you ask them, which is the greatest form of violence they experience? There's a bar graph. I can try and do interpretive dance for you, and I'll end with this. Violence from the people that we target that we think of as the main sources of violence. Pimps, exploiters, traffickers. Small part of the bar graph. Not diminishing the importance of that violence. Serious violence must be addressed, must be prevented. There must be full accountability for that violence. We must address it. But this is where it is on the bar graph. Violence by police, over here. Violence by healthcare institutions, over here. We're putting all the money over here to deal with this violence over here. Are we listening to the people we're trying to protect or not? That's the lesson we need to learn from this work that we've done. Thank you.